right now, somewhere on this planet, rain is falling that hasn't stopped in days. You've felt a version of it. A gray sky that won't clear. A weekend stuck indoors, staring out a window, waiting for a break that never comes. It's annoying, mildly depressing maybe, but you always know it will end. Your ancestors didn't have that certainty. For some of them, the rain didn't stop for weeks, sometimes longer, and the way they survived it is far stranger than simply staying dry. Picture a world with no roofs as you know them, no waterproof jackets, no umbrellas, just early humans, exposed, watching the sky open up again and again with no forecast to warn them, and no shelter built to last. Survival in that world wasn't about avoiding rain entirely. It was about outsmarting something you couldn't control. So what actually kept them alive through it? Start with the ground itself. Anthropologists studying early human campsites have found something consistent across wildly different regions. Shelters weren't placed randomly. They were placed on elevated ground, near natural drainage slopes, close to rock overhangs that channeled water away instead of pooling it. This wasn't guesswork. This was pattern recognition, passed down and refined over generations, watching where water gathered and where it didn't, then building lives around that knowledge. Archaeologist Lawrence Strauss has spent decades studying rock shelters across Ice Age Europe, sites where humans returned again and again, sometimes for thousands of years. These weren't caves in the deep, dark sense people imagine. Most were shallow overhangs, just enough stone above to break the force of falling water, positioned at angles that kept wind-driven rain from blowing straight in. The location mattered as much as the shelter itself, but finding the right spot solved only half the problem. Rain doesn't just fall from above. It seeps, it floods, it turns solid ground into mud that swallows footing and rots stored food within days. So early humans developed something you rarely think about when you picture prehistoric life: drainage engineering. Excavations at sites in France and Spain have revealed small trenches dug around the edges of shelters, channels barely a few inches deep, angled just enough to redirect water away from sleeping areas. Simple, almost invisible in the archaeological record unless you're looking for it. But functionally, that's the same principle behind the gutters on your house right now. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the water problem was solved with digging and positioning, why did clothing matter at all? Because staying dry and staying warm are not the same fight. Wet skin loses heat far faster than dry skin, sometimes over 20 times faster, according to research on thermoregulation and hypothermia risk. In a prolonged rain event, even a shelter with a perfect roof couldn't help if a person walked outside, soaked, and stayed that way. So early humans needed something that modern rainwear takes completely for granted: a layer that could resist water without smothering the body's ability to breathe and move. This is where a detail found by paleoanthropologist Ian Gilligan becomes strange in the best way. Gilligan's research into cold and wet climate adaptation suggests that some of the earliest treated hides weren't just about warmth. They were deliberately smoked or fat-treated, a process that made animal skin more water-resistant. Fat rubbed into hide fibers fills the microscopic gaps that would otherwise soak through. The same basic chemistry, incredibly, behind modern waterproof wax jackets sold today. Think about that for a second. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, sitting under a rock shelter during an endless storm, figured out through trial and repetition that grease and smoke could turn a piece of dead animal skin into something water simply slid off of. No lab, no chemistry textbook, just close, patient observation of what worked and what didn't, tested against a threat that could kill. And then there's fire. You'd think constant rain would make fire nearly impossible to keep alive, and for long stretches it was. But this is exactly why fire management became one of the most valuable skills a person could have. Ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer groups living in consistently wet climates today, groups researchers have studied specifically because their environments echo Ice Age rain patterns, show a recurring strategy. Fires weren't built in the open. They were built deep under overhangs, fed with resin-heavy wood that burns even when slightly damp, and protected by structures built specifically to shield the flame rather than the people. Protect the fire first. The fire protects everyone else. That single idea might be one of the most consequential survival principles your ancestors ever developed. A dry, warm space wasn't valuable because it felt comfortable. It was valuable because it kept infection away from wounds, kept food from spoiling into something dangerous to eat, and kept exhausted bodies from slipping into the kind of chill that hypothermia thrives on. Endless rain wasn't just wet. It was a slow, compounding threat that could kill through a dozen small failures instead of one dramatic one. But keeping a fire alive during a downpour required more than just picking finding the right wood. It required a kind of division of labor most people never picture when they imagine early human life. Ethnographic researchers studying present-day groups in tropical and temperate rainforest regions have documented something telling. During extended wet seasons, fire tending becomes a dedicated, near-constant role, not something left to chance between other tasks. Someone stays close to the flame. Someone else feeds it in small, careful amounts instead of large ones, because a fire smothered under too much wet fuel at once can die just as easily as one starved of fuel entirely. That single insight, feed it slowly, feed it constantly, is a piece of practical fire science that took real trial and error to learn and real cost to forget. Now picture what happens when a downpour lasts not for an afternoon, but for a week straight. Stored firewood runs out. Dry kindling becomes almost impossible to find. This is where another quiet piece of engineering shows up in the archaeological record: elevated wood storage. Small platforms built from stacked stone or lashed branches kept firewood up off flooding ground and away from standing water. It's the same reasoning behind a modern raised woodpile beside a cabin. Keep your fuel dry before you need it, not after. Clothing during a rain event tells its own story too. A single treated hide might resist water well enough for a short walk, but staying functional through days of exposure required layering, not just coverage. Evidence from cold and wet adaptation research points to a combination approach: an inner layer meant to trap body warmth even when slightly damp, and an outer layer, heavier and more deliberately fat-treated, meant to take the brunt of the water itself. Two jobs split between two materials, instead of asking one hide to do everything at once. It's a strikingly modern idea dressed in prehistoric materials. The same logic behind a base layer and a rain shell hanging in a hiking store today. Now here's the twist that reframes everything you just heard. You might assume that surviving endless rain was purely a battle against the elements, humans against nature, full stop. But some of the strongest evidence for how early humans handled prolonged wet seasons comes from something almost nobody expects: fungus. Researchers studying preserved organic material at wet climate archaeological sites have found early evidence of controlled fermentation and food preservation techniques that only make sense in a world where meat couldn't simply be sun-dried the way it could in drier regions. Wrapped, buried, and lightly smoked storage methods appear at sites associated with consistently damp environments far more often than at dry ones. In other words, when the sun disappeared for weeks, humans didn't just wait it out. They adapted an entirely different food economy around the absence of it. That single shift, learning to preserve food without relying on sunlight, may have done more to keep rain-heavy regions of the world habitable for humans than any shelter design ever could. A people who can eat through a month of gray skies can outlast almost anything the weather throws at them. There's also a psychological piece to this story that rarely gets mentioned. Long stretches of rain don't just threaten the body, they wear down the mind. Reduced sunlight, confinement, the sheer monotony of gray on gray for days on end, all of it adds friction to group living at exactly the moment when cooperation matters most. Some researchers studying small-scale societies in persistently overcast climates have pointed to something interesting here. Storytelling, shared songs, and repetitive craft work like weaving or tool shaping show up disproportionately often during documented wet season stretches, not because there was nothing else to do, but because sitting together under one shelter, hands busy, voices going, was its own kind of survival tool. It kept people calm. It kept people bonded. And a group that stays bonded through a miserable week is a group far more likely to still be cooperating and still be alive when the sun finally returns. Think about what that means for something as ordinary as a rainy day board game night or a group chat that gets more active every time the forecast turns gray. You're not just bored, you're running an old script, one that once had a much higher price for failing to run at all. And that brings you back to right now, standing in a room with a roof that never leaks, wearing fabric that sheds water without a second thought, walking past a fridge that solved the food spoilage problem your ancestors spent generations engineering around, with smoke and fat and careful drainage trenches. You still check the weather app before leaving the house. You still feel that small flicker of relief when rain finally stops. That instinct is ancient. It was built under rock overhangs, refined through trial and failure, and handed down so many times that it eventually became something as small and automatic as glancing up at a cloudy sky and deciding whether you need a jacket. Notice too what you reach for on a rainy day now without ever questioning it. A raincoat with a treated outer shell and a soft inner lining. A covered porch angled just enough to keep water from pooling whistling at the door. A habit of gathering people indoors when the weather turns, filling the time with a show, a game, a conversation that runs longer than it needed to. None of that is new behavior. It's inherited behavior, worn so smooth by repetition that it no longer feels like a decision at all. Right now, somewhere on this planet, rain is falling that hasn't stopped in days. And for the first time, you understand exactly what it took for your ancestors to make sure that never became the end of the story.